All right. So, Nancy, I understand that today we're going to be talking a little bit about an oil spill that happened 10 years ago now that was very impactful on the Gulf. But of course, prior to that, you were sought for your expertise on this subject anyway. Maybe we could start by first talking a little bit about your background and let our audience know a little bit about you that way.
Sure. Um, I am a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of New Hampshire, and I have been at UNH since 1983 as a faculty member. Uh, and since about 2002, 2003, right in that range, we started working at UNH with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. They have a program, a division, that's called the Office of Response and Restoration. And during oil spills, NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration provides the science to the U.S. Coast Guard whenever there's a spill on a navigable waterway or in the ocean or coastal waters, etc. And so NOAA uh, was interested in finding an entity that they could work with that would be an independent, kind of honest broker, so that during an oil spill, if something happened, they could rely on that expertise, um, and not have that individual or entity be kind of in the throes of politics, because NOAA has had experience with oil spills way back since before at the Exxon Valdez, and they knew that during spills, especially fairly significant spills, that there's a lot of politics involved, and so they wanted to be able to say, here's an entity that isn't involved in the politics. And let me give you an example of how that can occur, because it did occur in the spill that you're talking about, the Deepwater Horizon. So then I had colleagues that were at state universities in some of the affected states. And the governor of one of those states said, I don't like these faculty members saying things counter to what I'm saying. And so there was an issue about, well, how would funding come to the university, et cetera. So in this particular case, NOAA wanted an entity that was, had a really strong environmental engineering program, had a really strong marine science program. Is there something buzzing? Yeah.
No,
Okay.
I don't hear any.
Uh, Okay, I did there for a second. So
Okay.
anyway, they wanted a strong program. Well, UNH has one of the top 10 marine programs. We have a very
Right.
highly ranked environmental engineering program. And so we were ideal for that. Plus, we have no oil. We have no natural gas. We have no fossil fuels, and we're not going to, right?
Okay.
So here was a place where they could get expertise and yet not have the politics. And in fact, when the spill happened, the governor never contacted UNH once about it, right? It wasn't an issue. So that's how we got involved in all of this. And so my expertise has always been in thinking about biological degradation of contaminants, and particularly we've done quite a bit of work on petroleum contaminants. And I teach a course in marine pollution and have since I started. So that's always been an area where my interest was.
So, what has your research up to date shown us about the effects of oil spills, especially on a coastline?
Well, and it's not only, I want to be real clear, this is not only my research, this is the research that is collective. All right, there's a lot of research that's gone on, especially post Deepwater Horizon. But my job as in this process is to really um, and in this our center is to be looking at this whole extent of research and
Right.
trying to help figure out how to apply it. What does it mean?
Mhm.
We have a lot of working groups that we oversee and facilitate that actually evaluate research. And we get experts from all perspectives, okay? And they help us evaluate and get to the nitty gritty of what does this research mean? Does this research really support the claims that are made? Okay.
Okay.
And does that research apply to a given situation? And, I think um, our center, and it's very small. Our center is a couple of people, right? It's me and another person and graduate students. But our center um, is set up to have these kinds of discussions. And we believe that if you have the discussions based on the science and you take away people's perspectives and biases, etc., you can get down to just evaluating the science and the experimental design, and you can get people to agree
Okay.
on what it actually means. But what happens is most of the time, we're talking on a very high level, right? And we're not saying, well, here's how they did this, and here's how they set this up. Here's the little details. And as with everything, the devil is in the details, right, of how you conduct a study. And
Right.
so until you get down and look at those details and really look at the whole of the details, you can't decide what that research means and how you can apply it. And so that's what we try to do. Uh, and so I want to be real clear about that because the question you asked is certainly a valid one, but I want to have you understand that not very little of this work is our research. We are evaluating and trying to figure out how the the vast amount of research that's been done since the Deepwater Horizon applies.
Okay. So it sounds like you're taking research from all over the world, from scientists
Oh,
all over
yes.
the world,
Yes.
studying it to see what those details behind the research are. Make sure there's no bias in the
Right.
final outcome, and then kind of pulling them all back together again to come to some conclusions. Am I correct in
Right.
saying that?
Yes, yes. And how does it, and the most critical question is, and this is the other thing about the center, what we're charged with doing is figuring out how does this science apply to oil spills, okay? And spill response. So in a spill, you've got a response phase and you've got a damage assessment phase. And I can go into that and what that means in a minute. But
Right.
how does this research apply to those things? So let me give you an example. Some researchers can develop a model, okay? And that model might be able to predict where oil is going to move in a certain situation. Okay, certain temperature, water, certain currents, certain salinity of water, etc. Okay, saltiness. But if that model takes it's so refined and it's so specific. If it takes 3 days to run the model, it's not valid in a response because responders have to be responding quickly. Things
Yeah.
are changing quickly. Okay. So it might be a great model, but if it's not working in response time scales,
Mhm.
it's not going to be applicable. Another example, suppose that same model, all right, requires data that nobody could get in a response time scale, right?
Okay.
That you would have to be going out in ships and collecting lots of refined data sets. That's not going to happen during an oil spill. I mean, you can't even, during an oil spill, it's very restricted who can go into the area because there are fumes and there are all these health and safety restrictions. So just because that would be great data to have and make the model work really well doesn't mean we can get it in a response time scale. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So a lot of these things are, they are awesome, but they may not be something that's useful. Or there may be in the experimental design so many little assumptions made in the basic design, that they're not going to be realistic for what's actually occurring during a response in the real world, you know?
Right, because it's so important. It's my understanding, at least, and you can correct me, obviously, if I'm wrong. It's so important that during an oil spill, that things happen as quickly as possible,
That's
to
correct.
start to mitigate the damages that the ocean and its sea creatures are facing.
Right, or protect them as best as possible.
Right.
Right, there's always in an oil spill, there's always going to be damage. Right, I always start by saying, there's always going to be damage. What response is about is making the damage the least bad it can be. Least bad. It's going to be bad, but
Yeah.
we're trying to make it the least bad.
Right. Huh. So, with what are you folks finding since Deepwater Horizon as far as new methods that could be applicable in a future oil spill?
Well, I think there are some takeaways from deep water that we that have changed our perspective. Now, the one thing I want to say about deep water is it was very unique. It was a big, big, big spill.
Yeah.
Most of our spills are finite. You have a leaking ship. It's only going to leak what it has in it, right? Deep water was a well blowout.
Yeah.
So it's going to keep releasing for a long, long time, right? Until that reservoir is significantly depleted. So that is a long time. These are big reservoirs of oil, okay? So when you start talking about that, and of course, it was in very deep water and it's hard to work there. You know,
Hmm.
during the spill, people are always saying to me, well, why can't they just cap that? Well, think it's a mile down in the water. So imagine something a mile from where you live and it's totally dark. You can't see, right? You can't see where it is. And you're trying to hit something, a foot in diameter. This is not easy to do, right?
Right.
So now, of course, one of the big things that's happened that's different, and we're very, very good at doing what I'm going to say now. We're very good at reacting to what happened. That
Okay.
doesn't mean that the next spill is going to be anything like that, right?
No,
But
because each one is going to have different set of
right,
circumstances behind it.
right,
So,
right. So what one of the big takeaways is that industry has put in a very large amount of money, $1 billion, into developing what's called a capping stack, which basically is a device that is sits on land and can be put on a specially designed ship that can go offshore and it can be lowered down into very, very deep water and placed over the top of the well. They've spent a lot of money to do that with specialized equipment, et cetera. And they have, in fact, been required by the federal government, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, which was created as a result of Deepwater, to test that. Okay. They say that they could respond in a week to 2 weeks and get the thing capped, which would be huge compared to the 86 plus, it was about 86, 87 days, depending on how you count it.
yeah.
So it was a long
Okay.
time. Now,
Mm.
could you do that? I don't know. I think they could certainly do it faster than 86 or 87 days, but everything's dependent on the weather and all of these things, right? As to how fast you could do it. But certainly there is equipment now that we know is designed to meet that need. So that's one thing. A second thing that we now know is how important and how vulnerable marine mammals are.
Mm.
Okay. Now, we, um, I think we thought that marine mammals would sense the oil and swim away, right?
You would
Um,
think so, but not necessarily, right?
yeah, well, they don't.
Yeah.
So, and that isn't to say none of them do. I don't know what individuals are doing, but we do know now, based on very extensive research that has been funded by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative and by NOAA, uh, that marine mammals, what they do, of course, they have lungs just like us.
Yeah.
And when they dive, they take a very large gulp of air in through their blowhole, right? Just getting that clean air in, and then they dive and swim around and do what they do, and then they resurface.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, as you can imagine, when they come up, when they resurface, the first thing they want to do, just like if you and I were holding our breath, is to release that. Okay.
Right.
Well, now think about this. If you come up under a thin oil slick, even a very thin oil slick, all right, and you release that air, it's with a huge amount of force. And it creates little tiny, teeny droplets, aerosols. Everybody knows about aerosols now because of COVID-19, right? It
Yeah.
releases these tiny aerosol droplets of oil because the oil gets, okay? And what's the very next thing that they do? They take in a big gulp of clean air, okay? But the clean air now has the oil droplets, and that oil can get deep down into their lungs. And this is something we found out. They were these researchers, these veterinarians that specialize in marine mammals. They found that some of these populations, like in Barataria Bay in Louisiana, there's this dolphin population, and they
Okay.
found, whoa, these dolphins are not doing well. They survived. They didn't die necessarily. I mean, we're not talking about these dolphins all of a sudden popping up to the surface dead. But that isn't to say some of them didn't die from coating
Right.
from the oil, but this is different. So these dolphins didn't seem to be doing well health-wise because they were monitored post the spill. Birth rates lower, miscarriages higher, all of the survival of the young not as good,
Okay.
and even the adults weakened because they have oil in their lungs. This is not good, right? And of
Mm.
course, there are all sorts of things that causes and weaknesses, etc. So that's something that we know. And that, in fact, that aerosolizing, now suppose you have some dispersant mixed in there, which we used a lot of chemical dispersants for a good reason during the deep water to disperse the oil. And I can talk about that too. But that makes the aerosols even more potent. They get even tinier droplets, and it gets down into the lungs further. The smaller the droplets, the further down into the lungs they can penetrate, and therefore the greater damage.
Mm.
So we didn't think about this before. Now we know. We know how crucial it is to make sure that we are thinking about these marine mammal populations. And I'm just using those dolphins in Barataria
Right.
Bay are kind of the poster childs of this.
Okay.
Okay. Um, Another thing that um, we this is on a totally different track now.
Okay.
Um, we now realize that the stress, the mental stress that people endured in the Gulf states,
Yeah.
especially the coastal areas, was huge. We didn't think about that before, okay? And I'm not saying all these people were exposed to oil, many of them were not. But if you were a fisherman or a fisherman's family and you couldn't work, right? There's stress associated with that. If you were a Coast Guards person and you were involved in the response, even if you weren't out on vessels, you were at you were working a huge amount of time away from your family. Those kinds of stresses, and we now begin to accept them, right? With COVID-19, people can see, whoa, these are heavy duty stresses,
Yeah.
right? Well, these kinds of stresses have long-term mental health implications for the impacted people. And they are not necessarily out there on the front lines cleaning up oil. They may have many, many impacts. Okay. So that mental health impact is something that I don't think thought about so much. And a lot of the learning that has been done there is now applied in things like this impacts to people during COVID-19.
Can you give us a couple examples of that, Nancy, so people can wrap their head around it a little bit better?
So it's almost like a PTSD, right?
Mhm.
Um, kind of thing. And there's been quite a bit of research that's been done on this by folks at Tulane University and folks at with the Coast Guard, et cetera. And so if we think about, okay, we now are thinking, I'll give you an example within
Mm.
NOAA. We now realize that when you deploy people, okay, so NOAA has people who are deployed in response. Now, they might not, I'm not saying that they're out cleaning up oil. They are deployed in what's called a command post. So
Yep.
they might be thinking about, how are we going to do this tomorrow? How are we going to do that tomorrow? But they are away from their families for long periods of time, okay? And they can't go back and see them. So
Mm.
now think about the impact on the family, because now we've got mom or dad home with the kids and they're trying to manage a family and their spouse is away. And you right, all of these things we now think about
So
that
many similarities.
absolutely. And even thinking about how do we respond long term to hurricanes. There's long term response. We think about this now with Maria, etc., that people
Mm.
are responding or that people are impacted in those areas, right? And what are the impacts when you lose your job and now you've got to be able to cope, all of these kinds of things. And a lot of this research was done on the people impacted by deep water, either the responders or the communities.
Hmm.
And so we are better thinking about, whoa, how are we going to deal with this? And how are we going to quickly get involved to try to help ease some of this? So now, for example, we know that we need to support our responders. We need to support their families. We need to think about all of these kinds of things. Do we do it perfectly? No, but this has helped us think about how to do it better.
Exactly. At least it's part of the process.
We're thinking about it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's I don't think people think about that from deep water, but it was something we learned a lot about. Okay. Um, so another thing that was learned in deep water was that, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, that the droplets
Mm-hmm.
that come when you have water be turbulent, those droplets can be very, very tiny. And one of the things that a fellow that some researchers at Johns Hopkins University found was that, especially when we add dispersants, and again, I can go back to talk about why
Yeah.
dispersants were added. When dispersants were added as a response measure, and you're out there now, where I'm not talking about getting coated with dispersants or anything remotely similar to that. No, I'm not.
Mhm.
I'm talking about dispersants were used to do their job. They did their job. But then when you have dispersants, they are supposed to, and they do, make tiny, tiny droplets. Okay. And if you have droplets of oil that get up into the air, we now know that the personal protective equipment may not be fine enough to remove all of those droplets of oil. Okay. So, in other words, if people are wearing PPE, no one knew that term before this COVID-19 either, but when they're wearing that PPE during an oil spill, the equipment, the breathing, the respiratory equipment is based on a certain size distribution, assumptions of certain size distributions of oil droplets. Well, if they're smaller ones, that material may not be fine enough, right, to screen them out. So we learned that, and now these are all lessons learned. And part of the thing is that we have so much better science and tools to look at these things, right? These small size distributions. This was probably happening in other spills. We just didn't know about it, right? And another thing is that a lot of money, I mean, $500 million was spent on research post Deepwater Horizon
Okay.
on oil spill research. That is a lot of money,
But
okay?
that's part of the reason we have some of these answers we do today.
Absolutely it is.
Okay.
So where did that money come from? Well, I want to talk about two sources of money. One source of money was during the spill. You'll remember that BP, British Petroleum, the
Hmm.
spiller, the major spiller,
Yeah,
right?
I remember.
They pledged that they would give $500 million, $500 million for research. And in fact, they did. And it went to a group, it was overseen by a group of very distinguished scientists, headed by Rita Caldwell, who was the head of the National Science Foundation and a member of the National Academy of Science, etc. And there were 20 distinguished scientists who basically were on a research board, and they helped set up a wonderful system that was peer reviewed, et cetera, to do research. And it distributed over 10 years. In fact, it's just finishing this year, 2020, I think June 30th, 2020.
Okay.
And a huge amount of money went into research on all sorts of things. Much of this work that I'm talking about was funded. It was called the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, or GOMRI. So that's one thing. And then the federal government put in a large amount of money, billions of dollars, basically, to maybe not billions. I want to take that back. It's hundreds of millions. I don't know the exact amount,
I
but
can
it's
look that up. Yeah.
yeah, you can look that up. But so now I want to get to this second thing. So remember, I said there's response and there's damage assessment.
Right.
Okay. So the US has, as a result of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990,
Hmm.
has a three-tiered system that deals with oil spills. This is after the Exxon
I
Valdez.
was just going to say, is that in response to the Exxon Valdez?
Within 1 year, we had
Okay.
this major legislation. Can you imagine that happening today? No. But everybody in Congress got together, they wrote this piece of legislation, and literally 1 year later, it was on the books. Oil Spill Act of 1990. Oil
Yeah.
Pollution Act, OPA 90, it's called.
Well, that was such a shocking event. I mean,
It was
I
very
remember
shocking.
that distinctly
Yeah. Oh,
from
yeah.
my childhood. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, three things were in that. Well, four: preparedness, but I'm not going to talk about that. That's a different topic.
Hmm.
Response, and then here are the two unique things that basically the US is the real leader in. Damage assessment, okay?
Yeah.
So the responsible party has to pay damages to make natural resources and the public whole.
Hmm.
WHOLE, right? Whole, to the point but for the spill. And those are the words, but for the spill, right?
Okay, that makes
So,
sense.
what was it like in the environment and for the public before the spill?
Isn't that what taxpayers demanded, though, at the
Oh,
time?
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
So, how was this going to happen? And of course, Exxon Valdez was not governed by this, right? Because the event occurred before this legislation.
Right, but
So this is anything after. So what it
yeah.
means is that if a spill occurs, the government acts as trustees. Okay. So NOAA acts as a trustee for marine mammals. The National Fish and not the National Fish and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife
Mhm.
is the trustee. Their scientists are trustees for the fish, right? Because the fish aren't going to have be able to speak. So
No, I don't see many fish running around with
no,
briefcases,
no, no,
looking to take
yeah.
up lawsuits.
Right, you got it. So these trustees, and then this is not civil suits. The people can actually, fishermen, etc., they can have their own civil suits. But for the public, it's
Okay.
things like, oh, um, you go every week to down to Wallace Sands or something like that, and you take a swim, okay, in the water. You can't because there's an oil spill. It's shut down. So there have to be damages that are paid by the responsible party to compensate the public for this wrong, just
Mhm.
like for making new habitat and compensating the fish and the marine mammals, etc. Okay?
Yes.
So that might come in the form of, okay, we're going to build a new pavilion for bathrooms and showers and concessions at Wallace Sands. It's not you personally getting paid. It's making the public whole. So it's having a better facility, or maybe it's building a fishing pier, or maybe it's building better parking, all of these things. And there's a whole way that's decided, okay? But suffice it to say that that's what happens for the public. So there's a whole, you can't just say, oh, well, the damages are such and such, federal government, and the responsible party says, yes, I agree with you, because we're talking billions of dollars here.
Hmm.
So the responsible party has to pay for all the response, right? So they're paying for the response. Then they have to pay these damages. And so the federal government has to jump in, and the states do to some extent too. But the federal government is the lead here. The federal government, especially if it's a spill like Deepwater that affected many states, they jump in and they start assessing, well, what's the damage that occurred to the fish? What's the damage that occurred to the marine mammals? Remember I said the marine mammal research? That was those vets were out there, those veterinarians, because they had to make a damage assessment case on those marine mammals. So they were actually capturing marine mammals, taking samples of blood and blah, 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 to assess what's wrong with these organisms. Okay. So that's part of the damage assessment. And that went on, the damage, the that case was solved, or not solved, it was settled, is the word I want to use. It was settled in, I think, 2016, but I can't remember the exact year now. Okay, so the responsible party, BP, came to agreement with the federal government. This is the damages that you will pay. Okay, so they pay damages, and they have to restore. So they have to pay for all the science that the government did to establish the damages,
Mm-hmm.
okay, which was hundreds of millions of dollars. And they have to pay to restore as best as possible to where we were but for the spill. Okay?
Yeah.
So there are a whole range of restoration projects that are occurring in the Gulf to try and in some way restore what was lost during the spill. So you might be creating better habitat for fish to breed in, better habitat for birds to breed in, that kind of thing. Or, there are a whole bunch of ways that that can be done.
Okay. What was the third prong? Because I have written here response, damage assessment, restoration. So that is the third prong that we were
I'm
just
sorry I didn't make that clear. Yes.
No, I want to make sure for myself and our readers as well that we've covered everything that we've promised we're going to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about that technology. I know you mentioned the dispersing chemicals that were used during deep water. I'm sure at that time that was the best technology we had. What do we have now that can help us if a future oil spill occurs?
So I want to step back a second and say,
Sure.
when you, as a responder, are trying to make a recommendation to the Coast Guard,
Mm-hmm.
what response tools to use, okay? The best, obviously, the best situation is not to have the oil get in the water. So that your first line of defense, let's say it was a leaking ship, is to stop the leak from the ship, okay? Or to stop the leak from the well. That's always got to be number one. Even before that, though, you're going to be sure people are safe. So during deep water, when that rig exploded, you might remember that 11 people were not accounted for of the 128 maybe, or some, I don't remember the exact number, but there were more than 100 people on that rig that night when it went up, exploded. The first line of defense the first action is always going to be save the people. And those 11 people were not accounted for. So the first thing that was on everybody's mind, even when the rig sinks, etc., is maybe those people are somewhere. Maybe those people are on a life raft, maybe whatever. And this is true of a ship too that sinks, like the one that sank over in off China last year. Always, they're going to focus on saving people. After that is kind of okay. Then they start thinking about response. Now, sometimes the two are in parallel, but remember, the major focus is going to be, got to save our people. The other thing is, you are not going to put responders in harm's way. I mean, you're not going to send them into an area that has burning flames, right? That has flames, or something crazy like that. If there is toxic gas being released, they're going to be very reticent to put people in there. Or if they do, those people might be going in such specialized gear that it's very slow. But always that safety is very, very important. So after that, you want to try and stop the source if you possibly can. And then you're starting to think about, what do I need to protect? Okay? So you might be thinking, we've got birds over here that are, in the height of breeding season, which was what happened in Deepwater. We got to protect them. We've got this over here we've got to protect. And it's very, very limited number of endangered species, whatever it is.
Mhm.
So we kind of prioritize what has to be protected. And we know it's bad, so not everything's going to be protected. And we have limited resources that are available. So all of that is kind of going on in this command post. People are thinking about this, having to make decisions. And the Open 90 requires exercises and drills for just this kind of thing, so that it's not your first time thinking about these trade-offs, right? And nobody likes to say this, but there are trade-offs that happen. Okay? There have
There
to be.
have to be.
There have to be.
Yeah.
Okay? So what basically we were dealing with in Deepwater is an uninterrupted flow. We
Mhm.
couldn't stop that flow. So think about, it's almost impossible for people to think about 2 million gallons of oil a day coming out of a well. That's a lot of oil. In the first 5 days, even after we were not thinking about the people, the water was so turbid that you couldn't tell whether there was oil in it or not. Why was it so turbid? Because a big rig fell to the bottom. It
Mm.
fell 5,000 feet down with a whole bunch of pipe, and it hit the bottom. Well, think about all that muddy sediment coming up into the water. It was like chocolate brown. That was a big honking rig,
Yeah.
okay? So it took a while to know what was actually, and it was so deep we didn't even have things that could see what was down there. So okay, we're past that point. We now know there's oil coming out. We don't know how much. One of the big things that we know now is much better how to measure flows like that. We didn't back then. Okay?
Okay.
And so how do you measure that flow? I mean, it's one thing coming out of a tanker or a ship. You know the size of the hole about, you know how much material is in that vessel. But coming out of a well like that, boy, that's a whole lot different. And the other thing is we've learned a lot about how to communicate. We have to communicate. I don't want to say honestly, we have to communicate forthrightly.
Okay.
If you don't know, you got to say you don't know right now. And boy, we've seen a lot of examples of how people don't want to say that, right? They don't want to say, we don't know. We don't know when COVID-19, this problem's going to end, right? Well, they're saying that better now than they did in Deepwater. People wouldn't accept, we don't know. Well, you don't know sometimes. So you have to say, I don't know, we're getting this information.
Right.
So now we've got all this oil coming up. Now think about the response to this, okay?
Mhm.
What's the traditional response? The traditional response is things like, okay, you use a skimmer and you skim off the surface oil. All right? So this is something you pull behind a boat or on the side of a boat, and it skims off oil, collects it, separates, takes the oil, and it's disposed of. Okay, now think about this. You do your skimming, and as soon as you skim it, new oil comes to the surface because it's
Because
still
it's still
leaking.
being, yeah.
Yeah. So you can have lots and lots of skimmers, and we didn't have that many skimmers. This was a big leak, 2 million gallons a day of oil.
Mm.
And you take a swath and it's right back there. Okay? So skimming was hard to do, to keep up. Burning. Okay. And another problem with skimming is the Gulf during that period of time is traditionally very windy. and the winds blow onshore. So the wind was going to blow that oil onshore.
Okay.
What was there? Birds breeding. That was a key time in the mid to end of April into May. Major breeding of birds along the shores of Louisiana, etc. Major time. That's a very active reproductive time for animals and organisms. This oil was being blown onshore by the winds primarily coming onshore at that time of year, and the seas, because the winds built. You could watch the winds in the morning and be very calm, and then whoop, start building. And then what do you get? You get waves, and you cannot skim oil in waves. Can't skim, and you can't burn. If you want to burn oil, you corral it and then you light it, but you can't light it and do that when there's turbulence and waves.
Right.
So those two things, and you can only burn offshore. Well, luckily this was pretty far offshore. In the end, skimming and burning removed about maybe, it depends on who you read and what estimates, but somewhere less than 7% of the oil.
Really, that little?
Yeah, some estimates would say less than 5% of the oil. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, in a normal spill, you might skim 10% of the oil.
It's
Yeah.
that low.
Yeah,
Wow.
because you're depending on calm conditions. Now there has been a development on skimmers that can skim in higher wave levels, but
Mhm.
if you've got big waves, you cannot skim oil. The oil won't even stay on the surface. It gets put down below, and then when the water calms down, it pops up again.
So is that why they were using dispersants?
Absolutely, you got it.
Okay.
So we were asked during the spill, in the end of May, to convene a meeting of 50 experts from around the world during the spill to evaluate whether dispersants should continue to be used. And we got people who hated dispersants, scientists who hated dispersants, right? They were credible scientists, but they just didn't like dispersants for a lot of reasons, for what they believed were good reasons for toxicity, etc. And we said,
So for environmental reasons, they
right,
didn't like them.
we
Okay.
said, we want you to come to this meeting. And they came. This was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And we got those folks together and we said, we have to look at what we know now
Mhm.
and what the situations are. You're the experts. You are the people who know all about these birds and their ecology and what they're doing. And you are the people who know all about response technologies. And you are the people who know all about ocean modeling. What do you think we should do? And at the end of 3 days, all 50, now this is pretty amazing, signed on and agreed that skimming is always the best, but we couldn't do it effectively because of the conditions. And that we had, and I can send you that document,
Okay.
or Kathy can send you the document.
That would be
Okay.
great. We could definitely use all of that information.
And these folks signed on to and said, at this moment, with what we know now, with the environmental conditions we have now, chemical dispersants are our best shot to keep that oil out of these critical areas and critical habitats.
Mm.
That was what we knew. That was the best tool in the toolbox for that particular offshore spill. It would not be used, dispersants would not be used in a near shore spill. They are banned within 3 miles of the coast.
Okay.
They are banned unless there's water that's over 30 feet deep. But most of the inshore waters are even if they are that, it still has to be 3 miles offshore. So it again, I am not advocating for dispersants, and we've spent a lot of
No,
time
no, no,
having
no.
scientists talk about dispersants. But for what we knew then,
Right.
for those conditions, with all of, it would have been different if it was winter time, but we were in the peak of breeding season in the coastal waters. That stuff comes inshore. We're going to have oiled. I mean, you saw oiled birds. You saw a lot of the same bird over and over and over again on the TV reels. We had many less oiled birds than in Exxon Valdez. But why? Because of dispersants.
Okay.
Were dispersants good? They were the best tool we had for that situation. Remember, our job is to do the least bad. Doesn't mean dispersants are good. It just means they were the tool that was the least bad.
Okay. So we have about 10 more minutes in our allotted time frame, and I wanted to ask you, um, now we've talked a little bit about the best technology we had then. What technology do we have now that might be better?
Well, we do have a better skimmer, as I
Yeah.
mentioned. That came with the X Prize, and there was a whole competition, and that skimmer is better. Um, I would say not much.
All right.
We do have the capping stack, right? That we have. But the reality of it is that there's only certain ways you can clean up oil. Okay, you can get it off the surface. You can, with dispersants, dissolve it into the water and have bacteria degrade it. Right. You can get it off the surface by skimming or by burning, but of course, burning produces a residue, and skimming is hard to do to get it all up, right? Um, so there are technologies, but there are not that many things. I mean, when you think about it, there are just not that many ways. I mean, if we don't like it to get on beaches, but if it gets on a beach, you can scrape it up, right?
Hmm.
So and we can use boom to protect areas, right, to keep the oil from going in, preventive measures. But there just aren't that many technologies to clean to that are physically slash chemically possible.
How about advances within the oil industry itself? Have they taken a step forward to maybe make more secure ships and
Oh,
wells?
yeah, there has been and I am not the right person to talk about that.
No, 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 but I'm just
Yeah,
asking because if
yeah.
we don't have better technologies for cleaning, do we have better technologies for prevention?
I will say that as a result of deep water, the regulations on offshore oil wells have gotten a lot stricter.
Okay.
Okay. And when Deepwater occurred, there was something called the Minerals Management Service in the Department of the Interior. That agency, MMS, was charged with selling leases and regulating the lessees. That's not a good thing, right? That's like the fox being in the hen house. So now those are split. There's the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, BOEM, and BSEE, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. So they're two separate entities. And between the Department of Energy and the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, there is more requirements and process that has to be met when they're going to propose to drill and drilling. And BSEE has a lot more requirements, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, for actually enforce and making sure that they have a good response plan, that they maintain their equipment, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that's gotten stronger. Plus, they have developed a lot more technology for monitoring well pressures and this and that, and for drilling and what you have to do when you're drilling. But I cannot comment on that because that's not in my area.
No, but still, that's
Yeah.
great news and that's good
Yeah.
information.
Mhm.
Before we wrap up today, is there anything else that you think our readers should know?
Um, well, I think they should not be lulled into thinking that we're never going to have an oil spill again. Okay.
Yeah, that's fair.
Um, the biggest cause of oil spills, and I was testifying before the Senate back during this whole process, and one of the senators said to me, what do you recommend we do so this will never happen again? And I said, Senator, this will happen again. It may not be a blowout in the Gulf of Mexico, but we will have oil spills because the biggest cause of oil spills and the cause of the oil spill, the basic underlying cause of Deepwater Horizon was human error,
Mm.
human judgment. And you can put in a lot of safety measures, right? You can monitor pipeline pressures, you can monitor this, but we always engineer these systems so that humans with our brains can intervene. We want that, right? You don't want machines always controlling everything. But it's human error and in judgment that makes this occur most of the time, right? What causes most shipping accidents? Human error. When you look at ships that go down, right? Human error in judgment. That ship shouldn't have been out there in that storm, or they went off course, or they wanted to go in closer to the shoreline to see something, right? Who knows? You know what I mean. So we will have other spills. That's just the way it is. It's how well can we respond to them to minimize the damage, right? And make the least bad case. So, do I know what the next spill is going to be? No. I'm asked that a lot and I have no idea. I mean, I have some ideas where we have threats and where we have situations that are more high risk, right? As we drill in deeper and deeper water, as we go into more uh, difficult areas like the Arctic. But that's a long way off right now because the price of oil is so low. Drilling in the Arctic is not going to be a big deal. Drilling way offshore is not going to be as big a deal because the price of oil is so low, it's not economical to drill there. And we have a lot of oil as it is right now. And of course, hopefully we'll wean off of these fossil fuels. But there'll always be ships, and those ships will be fueled for a long time to come, maybe not forever, by fossil fuels. We'll have spills. It's just how well we respond to them when they happen and how well we minimize the damage and are able to restore from them.
Again, so many similarities to the
Yes,
COVID-19 pandemic that we're
absolutely.
going through right now. We
Absolutely.
can't pretend that there will never be illness again.
Yep,
It's how well we deal with it as a
that's right.
society. Thank
Yep.
you so much. You've been
Hey, thank
so
you.
generous with your
Oh,
time today, Nancy. We really,
thank
really
you for the great
appreciate it.
questions. And I've got meetings all day today, but
Yeah,
I will ask Kathy to send you that document. Okay?
please. Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you. Take care. You too. Bye bye now.
Bye.